Hi everyone, it's Rob Watson, the module leader for TECH3022 Social Media Practice. And this week we're going to, in the 9th lecture, we're going to look at the idea of food literacies. And we've established over the last few weeks our methodology, which is digital sociology or netnography. We've established the kind of common area of concern, which is the obesity, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, processed food disease kind of approach, contentious subject. But this week what I want to look at is some pathways that have got us to this point, if you like, and a useful way to think about this. And I think this is, again, I keep saying this through the sessions that we have, is that I think this is a really great analogy to help us think about our media, because it's a different topic, but the same principles can be said to apply. So we're thinking today about food literacies and how we learn to engage and cook and share food, and where that comes from and how that is, we understood that as a social practice, because it's an integral part of our society. And if we live and cook and eat in isolation, we are unhappy, and we are, we're anxious, and we report high levels of mental fatigue and depression and all sorts of social problems, which could be resolved if we had a culture where people ate with others. So how does that happen? Well, it doesn't come about by accident, that's for sure. What I want to start with is there's a really great book by, see if I can pronounce this name, Vielsis, I think that's right, probably wrong. I'll have another go at pronouncing it later on, who wrote a book about kitchen literacies. And it's a really great book because it goes through the history of American food literacies and how that changed over the kind of the from the colonialist period up to the kind of modern day, up to the kind of the fast food and processed food period. And she describes the kind of transformation of expectations of how different periods and different technologies were introduced, which changed the nature of how people thought about food. And you go from a kind of an agrarian society of producing and making your own food. If you didn't grow your own food and store your own food, you would starve and you wouldn't get through the winter. And the relationships with other homesteaders and villagers, and the trading and bartering, and how that, and then the rise of cities and urban areas which couldn't create their own food, which were dependent on farms to be able to create a transport and economic system which sustained life in the city, and the kind of expectations that people had about things like, if you think about freshness, what does that mean? And at the kind of, there's many examples that are used in this. They're kind of the kind of deception that was used to maintain the shelf life of products, so that they bringing in meat from distant farms via the newly integrated railroads into a city like New York or Chicago. Kind of the practices of this is before refrigeration. So how do you keep meat fresh and safe to eat? So it's it was a fraught activity, and you had to use your direct senses. So the skills, typically of the housewife, because it was typically a woman's role to run the household, to know what kind of food that you could buy and engage, and how you passed on that knowledge from mother to daughter, or grandmother to granddaughter, or extended family networks, or neighbours' kids, that kind of thing. It was a kind of a culture of passed on literacies and skills about what food, how to make food, how to prepare food, how to select food, and how to use food in the most economical way so that you got the most out of it, so there was very little waste, and how to your own animals, your own garden, that kind of thing. So the whole kind of changing culture that came about with mechanization, and you had the rise of things like tinned food and food storage, and then you had the rise of refrigeration, and then there was a kind of move in the latter half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century to cheap labor, cheap imported immigrant labor in New York, which meant that women could assume a more kind of bourgeois middle class lifestyle, and didn't have to do the housework because you could afford to employ servants. But what skills did they have? How did they know what was what was appropriate to buy? And kind of so you had to introduce formal schooling for cookery classes, basically, and what role they took in place. And there's a whole kind of issue about kind of the mechanistic process and the social process that takes place at the same time. And, it's really, you can trace through the kind of historical development of this, how governments have changed policies in order to be able to suit industry. And what happened after the 1950s, the powerful food manufacturing lobby devalued the home economics model of education that was taught in American schools and introduced convenience food. And being able to select and choose ready meals, oven meals, rather than making things from scratch, became a more dominant part of the curriculum, rather than it being something which was a necessary life skill that people needed. And it's maybe we need to go back to that model of keep out the food manufacturers and go back to that model of looking at the basic ingredients. On Instagram, it's there's various hashtags, isn't there? Kind of food prep and scratch cooking, that kind of those kind of models, where people share their experience of, hey, I've cooked from scratch. I've made everything myself. I've used nothing out of a packet. I've used nothing for convenience. Everything's made by me. And but the convenience culture kind of dominates where we are these days. So it kind of explains to some extent the other factors that drive the use of sugar and the use of carbohydrates, because it's also a social change that's taken place. And so we can look at this as kind of what was replaced by a kind of a culture of convenience, as opposed to a culture of skill and identification with a cuisine and a tradition. And kind of now we have a kind of a marketing-led culture which kind of fakes mama's cooking, that kind of thing. It's kind of it's just like your mum used to make. It's like, well, actually it's nothing like my mum used to make, but there you go. So I don't know where some of these people come from, but it's kind of that's the modern marketing imagination. That's how it works. Anyway, got some examples of some videos that we can look at, which hopefully will make this we can have some entertainment with this as well. The notes are up on the DMU Commons wiki. Just go to wiki.our.dmu.ac.uk and look at the TECH3022 section. But I will see you at the lecture on Monday.